The Battle of Brody was a tank battle fought between the 1st Panzer Group's 3rd Army Corps and 48th Army Corps and 5 mechanized corps of the Soviet 5th Army and 6th Army in the triangle formed by the towns Dubno, Lutsk, and Brody between 23 and 30 June 1941. It is known in Soviet historiography as a part of the border defensive battles. Although the Red Army formations inflicted heavy losses on the German forces, they were outmaneuvered and suffered enormous losses in tanks, poor Soviet logistics, German air supremacy as well as a total breakdown in Red Army command and control ensured victory for the Wehrmacht despite overwhelming Red Army numerical and technological superiority. This was one of the most intense armored engagements in the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa and one of the largest tank battles of World War II. Prelude. 1st Panzer Group, led by General Oberstpaul Ludwig Abald von Kleist, was ordered to secure the Bug River crossings and advance to Rovne and Korosten with the strategic objective of Kiev. It deployed 2 corps forward and advanced between Lviv and Rovne in an attempt to cut the Lviv-Kiev railway line, thus driving a wedge along junction point between the Soviet 5th and 6th Armies. The Southwestern Front, under the command of General Mikhail Kerponos, had received incomplete intelligence on the size and direction of the German attack. They were surprised when Stuka ordered a general counter-attack under the title of Directive No. 3 on the authority of Chief of General Staff Georgy Zhukov. Most of the headquarters staff were convinced that the strategy would be to remain in a defensive posture until the situation clarified. Later Hovhannes Bagramyan, a staff officer of the front headquarters who wrote the initial report to Moscow, said that, "Our first combat report to Moscow was full of generalities and unclear instructions. The general orders of Directive No. 3 read, while maintaining strong defense of the state border with Hungary, the 5th and 6th Armies are to carry out concentric strikes in the direction of Lublin, utilizing at least 5 mechanized corps and aviation of the front, in order to encircle and destroy the enemy group of forces advancing along the Vladimir-Vilinsky-Kristanopol front, and by the end of June 24 to capture the vicinity of Lublin." By the end of the 22nd of June, Zhukov was on his way to the Southwestern Front headquarters at Ternopil along with Nikita Khrushchev, the former head of the organizational department of the Ukrainian Communist Party's Central Committee, to ensure these orders were carried out. Disposition of forces. 6 Soviet mechanized corps, with over 2,500 tanks, were massed to take part in a concentric counter-attack through the flanks of Panzer Group 1. The intention was to later attempt a pincer movement from the north and south that met west of Dubno in order to trap units of the 6th and 17th German armies on the northern flank of Army Group South. To achieve this, the 8th Mechanized Corps was transferred from the command of the 26th Army, positioned to the south of the 6th Army, and placed under the command of N.I. Muichenko's 6th Army. This essentially brought all the mobile assets of the Southwestern Front to bear against the base of von Kleist's thrust toward Kiev. The primary German infantry formation operating on this sector of the front, 4th Army Corps of the 17th Army, were advancing southeast with the objective of cutting Lviv-Kiev railway line. German armor. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, German armor was composed of a mix of Czech and German tanks, as well as captured French and British tanks, in addition to vehicles supplied by the collaborationist Vichy France. Furthermore, nearly 50% of the tanks deployed by the Wehrmacht were the virtually obsolete Panzer I and Panzer II light tanks. Of the 4,000 armored vehicles available to the Wehrmacht, only 1,400 were the new Panzer III and Panzer IV. In the first few hours of the invasion, German commanders were shocked to find that some Soviet tanks were immune to all anti-tank weapons in use by the Wehrmacht. During pre-war exercises, Heinz Guderian noted that on their own, tanks were very vulnerable to infantry platoons. To destroy a tank on its own, the infantry needed to merely maneuver around to the more vulnerable sides and rear. From these positions, enemy infantry could either destroy the drive sprocket gear completely immobilizing the tank, or simply climb on top and drop a grenade down the hatch. The tank could then be destroyed at leisure. Furthermore, Guderian also noted that tanks lacked the heavy-caliber weapons needed to knock out reinforced concrete bunkers and heavily fortified positions, a role that could only be performed by heavy artillery or airstrikes. While dispersing tanks among infantry formations solved many of the tank's weaknesses, it also negated all of their strengths. Therefore, German military theorists concluded that to reach their full potential, armored units needed to be concentrated in their own formations and integrated with mobile artillery, mobile infantry, and close air support. Lastly, Guderian concluded that in order for tanks to be at their peak effectiveness, all armored vehicles must be equipped with radios so that each tank commander can hear instructions from the column commander, allowing each tank to work with all others in an organized fashion. Soviet armor. At the beginning of June, the Red Army boasted over 10,000 tanks in their inventory, most of them light tanks such as the T-26 or BT-7. The front armor for the T-26 was just 15 mm thick, and the BT-7 just 22 mm, offering virtually no protection against any anti-tank weapon at any range. Furthermore, the poor design of Soviet shells meant that most rounds shattered on contact, rather than detonating. More modern tanks and shells, such as the KV-1 and the T-34, were only beginning to roll off production lines in Leningrad, Kharkov, and Stalingrad and were not available in anywhere near the numbers that were needed to throw back the German advance. A Russian state television documentary, Soviet Storm, stated that for Soviet light tanks, it would prove to be a very short, very bloody war. During the interwar years, far-sighted military theorists such as Mikhail Tukhachevsky came to similar conclusions as Heinz Guderian regarding tanks in modern warfare. However, old cavalrymen such as Semyon Budyonny held favor with Stalin and Tukhachevsky was executed. Budyonny believed that tanks would never replace horses in warfare, and only existed to support infantry platoons in breaking through fortified strong points. Therefore, Red Army tanks were dispersed widely throughout infantry divisions in the 1930s. Then came the shock of the fall of France. Surviving armored warfare theorists such as Konstantin Rokossovsky were quickly and quietly reinstated in their positions and began assembling tanks into concentrated formations with all possible speed. However, by June 1941 this process was barely half complete. So many of the 10,000 tanks in the Red Army arsenal were still dispersed among infantry divisions on the eve of the invasion. This ensured that even if the Red Army had a unified command, many of its armored units would be committed piecemeal. German logistics at full strength. A German panzer division had between 150 and 200 combat tanks. However, tanks and crews require regular supplies of food, fuel, ammunition, and most critically, spare parts. To support these logistical needs, each panzer division was supported by 2,000 trucks. Furthermore, each panzer division had its own integral artillery and infantry support, which meant that rather than providing a supporting role for infantry, German panzers performed a leading role, with infantry providing support. Wehrmacht doctrine stressed the importance of training soldiers in combined arms tactics. Infantry learned to cooperate effectively with artillery, armored support and ground attack aircraft. The members of tank crews were taught to fulfill each other's roles. Most importantly, tank crews were also trained as mechanics, giving them the knowledge to fix broken equipment in the field. Soviet logistics. At the insistence of Stalin, no defensive preparations were made in the Soviet Union. That meant that ammo and supply dumps were not concealed. Compounding the problem is that Stalin strictly forbid any Red Army unit from opening fire on reconnaissance patrols. allowing the Germans to easily identify all major command posts, airfields, and supply dumps in the border districts. The result of these poor preparations meant that all of these points were all knocked out or heavily damaged by air raids in the opening hours of the war. Furthermore, Soviet tank crews were not trained on the mechanical details of their machines. That meant that simple mechanical problems resulted in hundreds of Red Army tanks being abandoned on the roadside en route to the battle. Those units that did manage to show up at their jumping-off points then discovered that the supplies had either been destroyed or moved to another location without updating their locations. After receiving orders to attack and now out of fuel or ammo, the crews of these tanks responded to their orders by blowing up their own vehicles and retreating. Hundreds of additional tanks were lost in this way before joining battle. Compounding these logistical difficulties was that each Red Army tank division had 300 to 400 tanks, but were supported by only 1,500 trucks, contrasting with the Wehrmacht tank division which had only 150 to 200 tanks, but 2,000 trucks. Experience would prove that the Germans got it right. Balance of the tank forces. On the 22nd of June 1941, the balance of tanks over the entire area of the German Army Group South and the Soviet Southwestern Front, including but not limited to the main Battle of Brody, was as follows. Battle in the air. The condition of the Soviet Air Force assigned to the Southwestern Front followed the pattern of the entire front line. The majority of its aircraft had been destroyed on the ground as a result of Stalin, disregarding intelligence that a German attack was imminent, refusing to put Soviet forces on alert. For example, Lt. Archipenko's 17th Fighter Regiment were caught on the ground and almost totally destroyed by the third day of the war. The remainder of the regiment, comprising only 10 I-153s and 1 MiG-1, retreated to a reserve airfield near Rovne. Still, the Soviets sent their surviving aircraft to support the offensive. The air battle resulted in heavy casualties for the attacking Soviets. JG-3, under the command of Flyer Corps IV, shot down 24 Tupolev SBs on the first day. Among the casualties was the commander of 86 SBAP, Lt. Col. Sorokin. Just 20 of the initial 251 SBs remained with the unit. German losses were also heavy, with 28 destroyed and 23 damaged aircraft. The efforts of the Red Army Air Force were not without effect, as the Southwestern Front Air Force flew 523 sorties between the 22nd of June and the 24th of June, dropping 2,500 bombs. Gustav Schrodeck, a tank commander of the 15th Panzer Regiment, recorded the scene. At dawn of June 24, the regiment underwent its first attack by Russian bombers. It shall not be the only one this day, completely the opposite. As a result of this, the regiment now has several dead and wounded. Near total Luftwaffe air superiority was to be a major factor in breaking up the Soviet counter-attack. Mobilization. The attack combined 6 mechanized corps under the command 5th Army to the north and the 6th Army to the south, under the general direction of Southwestern Front Commander Kirponos. Under the 5th Army command, Konstantin Rokossovsky's 9th and N.V. Feklenko's 19th Mechanized Corps were to be deployed northwest of Rovne, while the 22nd Mechanized Corps was to assemble northeast of Lutsk. To the south, under the command of the 6th Army, Dmitry Ryabyshov's 8th and I. Karpazov's 15th Mechanized Corps were to be deployed to the southwest and northeast of Brody, while the 4th Mechanized Corps under A. Vlasov was to be deployed between Sokol and Radekiv, on the left flank of the 15th Mechanized Corps. The plan called for these forces to assemble and begin offensive operations at 2200 on the 23rd of June, 36 hours after the initial German onslaught, in an attempt to catch the attackers off guard, and before they could solidify their position by bringing up reinforcements from the rear in support of their fast advancing 11th Panzer Division. Conditions were difficult for the Soviet Corps commanders. loss of communications, constant harassment by the Luftwaffe, lack of transportation, and the movement of large numbers of refugees and retreating soldiers on the roads made it difficult for the counter-attacking forces to assemble at their jumping-off points. While communication between the front headquarters and the individual army commands was generally good, communication to the frontline units was seriously flawed, because it was dependent on the civilian telephone and telegraph network. German sappers, air attacks, and Ukrainian nationalist guerrillas had aggressively targeted these systems. Many Soviet frontline commanders were left to their own devices, and this had an impact on the effectiveness of Soviet command and control. In one instance, the commander to the 41st Tank Division of the 22nd Mechanized Corps, for want of any new directives, moved his division to the designated assembly point for his corps at Kovel laid out in the pre-war plan, and in so doing, moved his division away from the fighting. Another endemic problem was the lack of transport for the infantry component of the mechanized corps, motorized in name only. Many of these divisions had only part of their full transportation establishment. Individual corps commanders had to improvise solutions to bring their full complement of soldiers to their assembly points. Rokossovsky commandeered 200 trucks from the district reserve at Shepachivka, but this still left him in the position of mounting much of his infantry on tanks. Even then, many soldiers had to walk, since the trucks were carrying critical munitions and supplies. In one case, heavy artillery pieces belonging to the 22nd Mechanized Corps was simply left behind for want of tractors to pull them. The commander of the 19th Mechanized marched his corps forward in two echelons with the tank divisions far in advance of his lagging infantry, which meant that his armored units arrived at the battlefield without infantry support. Ryabyshev, commander of the 8th Mechanized, reported similar problems. His artillery was towed by exceedingly slow tractors that held up the movement of the entire column. The columns were moving at top speed. Unfortunately, the tractor-towed corps artillery was falling severely behind. The difference in speed was slowing down the overall concentration of forces. These complications were compounded by the apparent inability of the Soviet commanders to assess an appropriate axis of attack in the context of the rapidly developing German salient. Between the 22nd of June and the 24th of June, the 8th Mechanized Corps received 3 different locations for its assembly point. The original order from the Front Command, a new one from the commander of the 6th Army, and on the 24th of June another order from the Front Command. The Corps crossed its own path and backtracked several times before finally arriving at Brody. Ryabyshev later wrote, around the second half of June 25, the Corps units deployed to the northwest to Brody. During the nearly 500-kilometer march, the Corps lost up to half of its older tanks and a substantial portion of its artillery and anti-tank guns to both enemy air attack and mechanical breakdowns. All of the tanks still in service also required varying degrees of maintenance work and were not capable of operating over long distances. Thus, even before the start of the counter-offensive, the Corps found itself in a drastically weakened state. As a result of these and other problems assembling the forces for the attack, the scheduled time for the operation was set back 6 hours to 400 on the 24th of June. By the time this decision was made on the evening the 23rd of June, barely 48 hours since the war had begun, the 11th Panzer Division, with the 16th Panzer Division traveling in its wake, had already penetrated 40 miles into Soviet territory. The 13th and 14th Panzer Divisions were well their way up the road to Lutsk with the objective of reaching the Sti River on the 24th, and the 44th, 298th, and 299th Infantry Divisions were moving up to consolidate the advance. Even with the delayed schedule, the counter-attack began piecemeal, since the full complement of forces could not be brought into position until 2 days later. The 4th, 8th, 9th, and 19th Mechanized Corps were still on the march, and supporting infantry corps were even further away. Kirponos's chief of staff, General Maxim Perkayev, argued against the political officer attached to the Southwest Front, Commissar Nikolai Vashugin, on this point, but Vashugin and Zhukov won out. The attack would begin without delay. Only 2 tank divisions of 15th Mechanized Corps in the south and a single tank division of 22nd Mechanized Corps in the north were in position to begin the attack on the 24th.